Hello and welcome to Colloquiapedia. Hello and welcome to Colloquiapedia, the short, sharp show making the complex comprehensible. Each week we take a popular word or phrase from the contemporary zeitgeist and attempt to understand it in a little bit more layman's terms. A couple of people asked me more recently, by the way, actually, why I sometimes say it like that, comprehensible. I think there remains a genuine trepidation in certain quarters today to open up and unlock the true meaning of specific terms. That could be anything from like your traditional cultural kind of classicist literary gatekeepers right through to industrial sectors today where we see a lot of specialization. Maybe it's, to do with AI and things like that. And it's very difficult, I think, sometimes for the people in those industries, even sometimes to have the incentive to open up some of this more specialist terminology to be understood in a more colloquial way. But then equally, of course, if you look at it from the other side of the coin and you think about the more humanist or cult of the individual driven society that we live in today, a lot of people might say, well, I speak my truth. And, the way I define a word or a thing, that's what makes it what it is. That's the only thing that makes it important to me. That's fine. But I think if we can't arrive at a kind of shared consensus and understanding about what things actually are and they mean and they do, the technicalities, how they're applied pragmatically, then that makes it difficult to have that public discourse. And, obviously we see that on the social and with the fake news else. Other bit of housekeeping, by the way. I am aware that my hair and beard do, for anyone watching, make me look like I've had an electric shock. This other thing that I'm filming, not Colloquiapedia, I have to keep the hair. So just be assured it's not some sort of fashion statement, basically. Far from it, in actual fact. But speaking of fashion, I'm very, very pleased to say that our word this week is magazine. And that's a medium that is itself has been through a whole evolution in terms of its form, particularly since the great migration of content online at the turn of the millennium. But equally fascinating, I think that magazines are still so prevalent within our society today. You literally walk into the supermarket, one of the first things that you see is magazines. You go online, there's still magazine brands pumping out content. The One Show is often referred to as a nightly magazine program. And I even think something like an Instagram, for example, where I wouldn't necessarily say that that was a magazine within itself, but I think that's brought forward a lot of the traditional traits of magazine in terms of its focus on visual image photography first, and then it has the captions in and around it. So magazines still massively important within our society today. And we think that the term originated in the 16th century from the Arabic word magazine, which means depot or storehouse, before passing into English by the French magazine or Italian magazzino, at which point, in its original sense, it very literally referred to like a storage space or a device, which again, I think is absolutely fascinating etymology when we think about the way we might consume some of that sort of magazine content today, particularly on, say, like an Insta. It's on your phone, which is in your pocket, which is also a storage device, kind of all your stuff and all your photos and everything. Now, today, Oxford via Google defines a magazine as a periodical publication containing articles and illustrations, often on a particular subject or aimed at a particular readership. And important there again, I guess, because it distinguishes between more kind of general current affairs or news content. I am also aware, by the way, that magazine can refer to like a thing that holds bullets that you put in a gun. Interestingly, also, of course, a storage device, but not the one that we're going to focus on today. But who better to help me focus in on the media side of the word magazine than Jeremy Leslie, who's the founder of Mag Culture, and I'm going to say a genuine living legend in the industry who's been producing, talking about, consulting about magazines for over 40 years. Today, Mag Culture has a real life, tangible print magazine shop in the real world in Clerkenwell, London, where people can go and see the most cutting edge, innovative publications from the magazine world that we've got on offer today. The shop was, in fact, once called by Creative Review the spiritual home of independent publishing, and this year it celebrates its 10th year in operation. So, as always, I began by asking Jeremy if he could please define the word magazine in his terms as he sees it today. So I'm delighted to say that Jeremy joins us now. Jeremy, welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you for very much for joining us today. And I think, as always, we'll just dive straight in.
Sure.
And I ask you to start for us, please, by giving us your definition of the word magazine as you see it today.
Well, for me, the word magazine is obviously central to everything that we do, and we spend a lot of time thinking about it. Frustratingly, it's a word that when I'm typing, I always misspell it.
Really?
Yes, which that's another story. But I get it's not. I go MAAG instead of MAGA. Anyway, that's another story. But in terms of what the how I see how I would define the word, a magazine is something that is part of a series.
Right.
It's as simple as that. I'm open to magazines not being printed items. I'm open to magazines not being, what many people might think to be the kind of more limited definition of a magazine being a printed periodical. I think it's simply a periodical.
That is really fascinating to me, because I had saying to you, I had Dominic Ponsford from Press Gazette on earlier, and I asked him about journalism. And me coming from a media background, I think with some of these terms that are more close to the industry, I sort of at least have a working understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't necessarily know you were going to say that. I thought you were going to say, it's a medium that began in print and now it's a medium that stretches onto other channels. So it's quite interesting that you define it in that way, really.
Well, I mean, that's that. Obviously, there's probably several more paragraphs to be added to that, but the quick definition is that.
And so, if we think about magazines and the way that they've developed over time, my understanding, which is probably wrong, but even having worked for the Periodical Publishers Association, now the Professional Publishers Association, over the years and stuff, is that maybe they, in a way, started as like newspapers, less well regarded or less well respected younger sibling, where it was more about entertainment and fun than it was about being very rigid and getting the news. And then they've evolved from that. Is that fair to represent that as the starting point, or was it just never like that anyway?
It's not unfair. I think it's probably the way I would put it is that in a way the more kind of fundamental idea of how printed publications started, the things that we later became known as magazines. I think the newspaper and the magazines, such as we divide them today, were very much came from the same source and were almost one thing. They were a black and white printed sheet or sheets of paper that were perhaps bound in some way, that were kind of scandal stroke gossip sheets distributed around the coffee houses of central London in the sort of 18th and 19th century.
Right.
And then it wasn't really an issue. It wasn't a case of, well, this is a magazine and this is a newspaper. It's just a case of read this.
Right.
I'm thinking, from the perspective of this podcast and the interest in the word. It's only later that the word magazine was applied to the publications. so but then but then later on, at some point the two did diverge. Well, different things happened that meant there were two divergent directions, and one was one followed through to becoming the daily newspaper, which in a sense was more true to what the original kind of scandal sheets that I'm talking about were. And then there were then also the sort of more perhaps, I guess, consumerist, uh, publications with a more consumerist agenda, which grew up around the kind of mechanization and the mechanization and industrialization of our cities, um, and the new middle classes, and so the sort of slightly smarter form of print publications were focused on this new type of person who had a bit of spare cash and were willing to flash it.
Yeah, one of the cultural phenomenons that I'm really particularly interested in about magazines, and maybe for all I know, like the youth today who are kind of on the Insta and stuff, they might not even c- comprehend like just how big some of the magazine brands
Mm-hmm.
were, in terms of maybe we think about the fashion brands or men's magazines or whatever it was. So like how did that happen? Was it like in the 60s with like wider cultural shifts that magazines started to become so central and so influential and so fashionable and almost like help people to centralize around um, identities and stuff like that?
I think it can sometimes be hard to express just how influential and how central the glossy magazine was to our society and our kind of media habits. And that kind of developed after the Second World War, particularly in across Europe and the United States, um, as people began to bounce back from the austerity and the restrictions of rationing, etc. Um, New lifestyles were promised, and I think all these things kind of come together. And in our country, in the UK, there was and in the States, there were the governments with new deals and new promises, and looking forward into the late 20th century. And there was a big kind of post-war effort to re-establish a better world, and with that came a very busy consumerism, and through the kind of late 50s and 60s, we saw magazines reflecting the rise of new household items, to make the life easier, new food ways of dealing with food, all sorts of new products were being invented, and magazines both reflected them and led this kind of idea of there being a new world, the modern world, and they took a lot of advertising, and they were very, very successful, and they became money machines. And so at one stage, perhaps initially, had been quite creatively orientated and inventive, um, inevitably through 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, that grew to such a scale that they actually became quite risk averse. And what had been quite innovative became quite restricted by their own success. But the magazines built the state. I mean, you mentioned the men's magazines. The men's magazines in the UK were selling. FHM was selling 1 million copies a month,
Yeah.
And that's an unbelievable number. At that time, I mean, in the early 2000s, I was working for a company called John Brown Publishing,
Yeah, I remember.
and for a few years there, we were producing a magazine for Sky Television,
Remember that.
um,
Yeah.
and that was a monthly magazine. And if you subscribe to Sky, you've got a copy of this magazine. And we were printing 7 million copies every month.
Yeah. Do you know what? All of this, it was like basically we still conceptualized it as kind of customer publishing back then,
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
we? And I can remember looking at the figures when I first come into the industry, and it was like these sorts of titles are really the ones that are doing the numbers
Hmm.
and proving to be most popular in terms of circulation. I
Yeah.
find it fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, but that particular magazine, we were printing 7 million copies a month. So every subscriber to Sky got a copy in the post every month. Um, but so that's probably the biggest magazine in the UK that there has ever been, as far as I'm aware. But nonetheless, and also it's free. It's a free, as you say, it was produced by Sky for its subscribers. But there were also these, monthly magazines like FHM. Um, there were weekly magazines like Heat and Hello. There were magazines that were selling hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of copies every issue. And it was huge. And they were really, really core to, they were central to our understanding of the world.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of words there previously, glossy and consumerism. So if we just fast forward slightly to the great migration to digital, um, magazines became really big digitally, magazine brands. So did we lose something when we lost the kind of physical first component in terms of both the prestige of the physical items, say, but also their ability to curate as much and to pull in, the information they wanted and
Mm-hmm.
leave it at those boundaries rather than just publishing, say, more and more digital articles. What was digitization ultimately good or bad for the magazine, basically?
Uh, it was mixed. I mean, this is where, I mean, if you look right across the kind of breadth of the magazine industry, in a way, the word magazine doesn't suffice for the number of different types of magazines that there were, and that there are. Which is why you end up with so many different kind of extra words being tagged, whether it's customer magazine or consumer magazine or sports magazine, women's magazine, men's magazine, monthly. There's so many different kind of frequencies to publishing. There's so many specialist genres of publishing. Um, the, the the period that you refer, or did you say the great digitalization?
It's sort of the migration,
Or the
really.
migration, sorry, the great migration to digital. Uh, there were some immediate casualties to that, and that was the weekly magazines that relied on advertising for, well, recruitment for jobs, um, and relied on news. So every profession, architects, accountancy, journalism. Um, you mentioned Press Gazette, that used to be in print, and now it's online.
It's fascinating that you mentioned this because when I spoke to Press Gazette, one of the key things that they cited as having changed when we switched to digital was classified ads. Like, and you've mentioned recruitment ads there, like, because obviously as soon as Google or Yahoo, whatever before it becomes that way to get that sort of information, that completely takes that
Mhm.
monetization away from the printed
Yeah,
page, does
yeah,
it?
yeah, and I mean, I think from a publishing company's perspective, these were big companies that were hugely successful, had grown. Whether you're producing glossy women's monthlies or weekly specialist titles for the press industry like Press Gazette. I can't remember who it was that actually published Press Gazette, but it was part of a larger company with specialist titles for all sorts of different areas of activity, and they all were faced with different challenges by the arrival of the digital channels. The weekly professional B2B magazines like Press Gazette were always going to struggle because suddenly, frankly, it's much easier to search for a job and search for information online than it was to flick through pages of a magazine.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas the kind of more experiential thing of well, the more specifically experience of flicking through pages work far better, I would argue, for a glossy magazine than it did to try and mimic that online. Um, I did quite a lot of work in the early noughties when I can't remember the exact dates, but I guess around about 2008, 9, 10, when the iPad came out, and the idea was that the iPad app was going to replace the printed magazine. And so you would download a free app through which you would be paying the publisher to buy the latest issue of the magazine, and it would appear on your iPad. And there was some amazing kind of development in terms of creative work and building in video and all sorts of things. And I had a great time. I really enjoyed working on those projects. I worked with Port magazine. I worked with FHM, as it happens. Um, but it was madness. You know, you were trying to do something. It was it. You could make things happen, but it was just so time intensive. It was never going to work from a financial, let alone a kind of scheduling point of view.
Well, I remember that, and it was almost like my dad always used to tell me this expression he had about when YouTube came out. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, as in like the nature of the content
Mm-hmm.
itself has changed. And I remember when we started trying to basically recreate the printed page on the iPad, and it was almost a bit of a way to like sort of try and cling on to the days
Yeah,
gone by
yeah,
rather than evolving the content to evolve alongside the distribution
yeah.
channels.
But but as you know, it like there was this, this whole idea transferred from Silicon Valley about you have to break things to make the future, and so people were pouring money, just as they had in the original .com bust. They're pouring money into the iPad apps, and that's never going to go anywhere. Um,
Yeah, a lot of people made a lot of money off of that.
Someone, well, I don't know, someone somewhere did,
Yeah.
but it wasn't the publishers.
No.
Uh, but more, but that was typical. It was a part of what was happening then, and that was people struggling to figure out what they were going to do with their print magazines. I argued at the time, and in retrospect, I still argue that people should have been investing in their print products and making them as brilliant and as stronger than ever, But instead, people began to cut corners and reduce the quality of the paper, reduce the body count in the office, generally kind of try and chase their margins to make sure they kept on making their money. And it was a downward spiral. So, hence we now end up in a situation where a lot of the grand old titles of publishing are struggling to justify their existence. Many have gone, of course.
I think
Um,
that perspective now has been proved to be right, particularly in the post-lockdown
mhm.
era where there appears to be such a vacuum of stuff. We can't go down the record shop and get CDs anymore, or we don't have DVDs. Like, I think magazines and books are becoming a nice to have in a way again, just to have
Mhm.
that physical product.
Well, what we've seen with the new generation of independent magazines is just that. There's they're celebrating their print status. They're loving their physicality, their tactileness, the fact they are concrete things that you have in your hands. The magazines celebrate that, and the people who are enjoying them relish that. Um, and there is definitely, it's a minority, but it's a significant niche of publishers and readers who want that and are enjoying that, and that's what we see day to day in the shop um, is more magazine, and as you rightly say, since the COVID pandemic, this has only sort of strengthened things. I think people, there's all sorts of talk at the time about how we're going to reinvent our lives and it'll never be the same again, and largely we've gone back to the same again. But there are some things that have followed through on, and I think a lot of people have sort of rethought their media intake and are more interested in having physical items again than they were. They slowed down for a year and a half, and they're reluctant to just go 100% back into digital. Obviously, I mean, it's this isn't an anti-digital thing. We're recording this on Zoom, and I couldn't live without my iPhone. But um, there's some other examples of the importance of digital that I want to come to in a minute. Um, but people want a choice. They want some time away from it all, and magazines provide that. And I think the new independent magazines are doing that very, very successfully and finding a market, finding a readership, and building really, really loyal, tightly bound relationships.
Yeah, so just before we do jump back onto digital, you mentioned the shop there, and that raises a good question that I've often wondered is like, where do you draw the line sometimes between a magazine and a book? Like, say, for example, a publication's coming out, even like you might have even now an annual publication or a twice annual publication. Is there a point at which, like, the curation or the process or the just living envelopment, is there a point where that stops being a magazine and starts being a book? Like, does it matter?
Well, I think the first thing to say, it doesn't matter. Um, but I understand why it keeps coming up. I mean, it is, we have people come into shop and, you know, sorry.
That's all right.
Um, we have people come into the shop and it's probably the first time they just walk past and they come in and they say, this is a bookshop, right? And I think there's two reasons they're asking. One is a lot of the magazines are very different looking to the magazines that they maybe have just seen next door in the supermarket. Um, and the other is some of them are literally are kind of like bookish. They're hardback. They can be confused physically for books. Um, I don't think it particularly matters in one sense, but I go back to my original definition of a magazine. The point is that it might be issue one and it's a hardback book, but issue two is coming in 6 months or 12 months, and as soon as issue two comes, it's a magazine. It's a
Yeah.
series. It's a um, and that might seem simplistic, but one of the most powerful things and the most interesting things about magazines, I think, is that they are part of a series and that they, you know, people. If you're making a book, it has to be the most perfect item ever. You have to be has to be honed to the nth degree. And if it means putting it off for 6 months, you'll put it off for 6 months. But it has to be correct and it has to be fact checked and it has to go through all the processes. If you're making a magazine, you just got to get on with it because you've got to get issue one out because then you've got to start planning issue two. But by doing issue one, you learn a lot and then you look at it and you get disappointed about some of the things that you did. But then you can look forward and improving it for issue two and then improving it again for issue three, and that's the magazine maker's experience is you have to dive in and do it. I don't think anyone wants to admit that they don't put the same amount of care and attention that they might into a magazine as they would a book, but the fact is you've got to get the magazine out, so you will cut, not cut corners, but you will just have to make decisions and get things done for the sake of getting them done rather than delaying it for 6 months. So a magazine is always, by its very nature, an imperfect thing on its way to perfection.
That's a great phrase. I never really thought of it like that, but the parameters, the actual physical, logistical, real world parameters of having the periodical schedule in a way, A, make a magazine what it is, and B, you're right, enable people to get stuff out there without
Mm-hmm.
the temptation of perfectionism.
Yeah.
And that's kind of part of what makes it so good in a way.
Well, I think that's what people get excited about is that you're entering into a process rather than a simple beginning, middle, and end. And here it is. Well, here it is, but we're doing another one now.
And we mentioned books there. Let's say audio books are the modern incarnation of printed books or just the new.
Mm-hmm.
Is it too far a stretch then to say that, the podcast is like a modern audio magazine in a way?
Um,
Yes, you're going to tell me.
I, I can see why you're suggesting that. I'm not sure. I suspect. I mean, obviously, it ticks the box in terms of being part of a series and being, there's episode one, two, three, four. I think maybe it has more in common than radio.
Yeah,
Um, but then there are podcasts and there are podcasts. Again, there are some which are far more singular in their. Um, I think something like all the really popular kind of goal hanger podcasts have a magazine feel to them in that they've got, they have this. Well, a lot of podcasts follow this format, but there's two or three people in the room having a chat about stuff, and so you get different opinions. And I think some of those are quite magaziney in their outlook, but I also think there are some which are far more almost like radio drama.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, so I wouldn't. I get a bit anxious about it, sort of comparing different mediums. I think, for instance, I think the idea that the rise of independent magazines is often kind of compared and contrasted with the return of vinyl,
Yeah,
and I can kind of see that, and I respect that, and there are obvious similarities, but I think fundamentally there are some very big differences. I think, you know, I love listening to music. I listen to music all day at work. We have Spotify playing on our Sonos system, um, and have it at home. I always have music, but then I also at home have a deck, and I enjoy listening to some music on vinyl. So I still listen to some vinyl. But if I switch from a vinyl record to uh, whatever digital format is being played on Sonos, you're actually playing the same item just on different systems, and audiophiles will start getting pernickety about, oh, but the vinyl's better or the CD's better or whatever. But essentially, it's just the same stuff being presented in a different frame or a different system. Whereas I think um, the the printed magazine as opposed to the digital magazine are two much more different things. In fact, I would argue there isn't such thing currently as a digital magazine. There are editorial websites, but it's not a magazine.
no, and I tell you something I've just remembered, even just while we've been talking, is not that I was personally necessarily a massive fan of it, but when we look at that period from the beginning of the migration and digitization of the printed page and magazines to say
Mm-hmm.
one that just struck me was BuzzFeed.
Mm-hmm.
In that, again, the content wasn't always necessarily what I thought was great for me, but in a way, it was one that was more true to like old school magazines. If you think about like Vox Pops and the way designers would break out content into different
Mm-hmm.
features and stuff, BuzzFeed at least sort of attempted to adhere to that, didn't it? In the way that it had like quizzes or it
Yeah.
had, these are the 10 pictures. And I think that's one of the last incarnations or attempts I can really remember to take that level of creativity and variety
Mm-hmm.
from the printed magazine and put
Yeah.
it
No,
into
I mean what they were doing was exactly taking well well seen, well developed, established formats and translating them into the digital world. Yeah, interestingly, that then had an effect on the printed magazine world. A lot of magazines tore up the idea of having long form journalism and just became listicles and diagrams and it became all easy bites rather than young people won't read long form writing. There's all this nonsense was put about, which proved to be just stupid propaganda. It was nonsense. Um, but yes, I mean, but I think it goes more fundamental than that. I think again, what the simple makeup of a magazine is, and I'm surrounded by magazines, but they're all not kind of accessible right now. Let's see if we get this one. You know, The fact is that a magazine, there every time you open it, there are two planes, there are two surfaces, there are two pages at a time.
Right.
Whereas here, there's just one. So
Yeah.
on your phone, you're just scrolling through stuff, and any other kind of and any advertising or any other message that has to come across has to interrupt literally the reading or the images of the videos that you're watching. Whereas in print, the two can sit side by side, and it's a much more kind of leisurely, a very different experience. So I think, as I said, I don't think there is such a thing as a digital magazine. There are representations of magazines in digital formats, but they become websites or they become Instagram feeds or they become whatever it is. They become something else that is not magazine.
Well, I was gonna ask you about Instagram, and maybe it's I go back to my sort of idealized interpretation of the boom of magazines in the 60s with fashion photography. And I always in my head have a bit of a link between Instagram today and the sort of big magazine industries of old. I would say, is there something magazine-y about Instagram? You'll probably tell me,
Mm-hmm.
no, that's mad. But is there more similarity in, say, that platform than there would be a Facebook or a Twitter or a LinkedIn or whatever? Is there something of the magazine about that in the way the content is presented and consumed?
I think there is. I think I can absolutely see the comparison you're making. Um, I think that but there are also kind of key differences as well. I think uh, Instagram, by its very nature, is meant to be just addictively enjoyable for you to flick through stuff and you keep flicking. Generally, the material you're looking at has been curated or put together by a relatively small team, or even indeed just one person. Whereas a magazine is much more mediated in terms of how you. I mean, a print magazine like from the 60s. If you look at something like Nova from the 60s, which was in a sense the equivalent of Instagram today, insofar as its role was similar, very different as an actual thing, but nonetheless its role, you know, publishing material in a monthly glossy women's magazine full of fashion like Nova did. Um, that was where you saw it. There was no, you, there wasn't it wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't appearing in your newspaper. It was only available in the monthly magazine, so that was as fast as you could get it. So when you open your copy of Nova, you were seeing stuff for the first time, and you were thinking, "Wow, this is extraordinary. These shoots that they've been preparing, these
Yeah.
amazing photographers they've discovered, and the young models and the new clothes, the whole swinging 60s thing, that was seen for the first time in a glossy magazine. Today, that kind of thing is seen for the first time on Instagram or other socials, probably TikTok, in fact. But uh, but it comes and it goes. You know, we have the luxury today of looking back 60, 70 years to the mid 60s and flicking through our print copies of Nova and thinking, wow, that was amazing, or that was interesting, or that was horrible, or whatever we think. But it is a really strong record of that era that's been mediated and honed and carefully worked, and is from the perspective of the people that made it an accurate rendition of London in the swinging 60s. But if we want to look back at the fashion of 2025, we will find ourselves looking back at the print magazines. We're not going to be looking at Instagram.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like the more you think about it, like structure and stuff like that. Like if I look at stuff from say more of a marketing point of view, I always think, right, you need products so that you can package things up that A gives you parameters to work to know what it is you're actually delivering, and it B simplifies or helps the potential audience to interpret that. And it's again, as we've said earlier, it's so true that a magazine, by its very nature, it almost provides a structure for the creative process.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to say, right, I've got a schedule, I've got X amount pagination, we know we need to hit XYZ themes. There'll be so many features or whatever. And as a vehicle for creativity and for production and publication, it's just like an amazing vessel, basically, isn't it?
But you're absolutely, but it's a finite vessel as well. It's you mentioned pagination, and I think that's key. Is that there's a limited amount of space. So, if you read any biography or autobiography of the great editors, and a lot of people's stories are coming out now from the 60s and 70s about the heyday of publishing, and they will talk about how they would commission more stories than they had space to run, and they would drop stories because there was a limited space. So they would, they were able to, they could afford to, and they would expect to drop 20% of their content because and choose the best stuff. Whereas, the obvious, comparing to Instagram, for instance, as you have, um, you're not given. We're very busy on Instagram. We use Instagram to sell and market what we have in the shop. Um, and of course, you do it, and you're thinking all our followers are going to see this, but they don't.
Yeah.
It's just completely random who sees what, and well, it's not even random. It's kind of the
Algorithmic.
algorithm kind of controls it to some manner, but it's not the same thing at all. You're not able to, if I buy a copy of a magazine, I pick it up, I know I've got the same magazine that somebody in Amsterdam or Berlin has picked up the same magazine, let alone across town here in London. If anybody picks up that magazine, they're getting the same magazine, and we can kind of share in our experience of it if we want to. But if everyone is anyone is following the mag culture Instagram feed, they're all seeing different bits and different, some might not see any today, but some might see some tomorrow. They will see this, they won't see that. um
Yeah.
it's a very different thing.
And how, because you're curating your own timeline or your own feed based on all the different stuff you follow,
Hmm.
how different components fit into the overall
Yeah,
puzzle as well
yeah.
is going to affect your interpretation of it, isn't it?
It's
Like,
I have a personal Instagram. I have the mag culture Instagram. We also have a private test area where you can test various things that we do on Instagram, and it's really interesting seeing what gets served up. On my personal Instagram, I see some of the mag culture content, but not all of it by any means. And then meanwhile on the test site feed that we have, it's different again. It's weird. I mean, we know it happens, but when you see it, it's astonishing.
I find it really strange, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to sort of build content and messaging from the inside out more these days. I don't know if you've ever read any of Rick Rubin's stuff or heard.
I haven't. I've got the book, but I haven't read it.
No, it's a great book. Actually, I can't remember what it's called, The Art of Creativity or
Yeah, yeah,
that.
something like that.
But he very much is a proponent of like make stuff for yourself that you want to be seen or you want to consume, and by doing that, you're instantly going to make it better for the audience. As soon as you start thinking, okay, the advertiser wants X or the investor wants Y,
Yeah,
you're immediately diluting that. Now, obviously, as we've said, once you start to scale up, particularly, that's easier said than done. You're always going to have those commercial pressures on you. But again, I think a magazine embodies that process more than anything else, maybe an album as well, where you've just got to eat it the way that you see it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
obviously, I can wax lyrical about it all day, but I just love that about it, basically.
But I mean, that's we talk to a lot of people that are either publishing or want to be publishing, and one of the key things is exactly that. Listen to as many different people and as many bits of advice as you can. But ultimately, if you're going to do it, you do it. You do it your way. You make it your thing and learn. That's the best way to learn how to do something and how something will work is to take on board the advice that you think you need, but then be careful what you actually carry through on. You can't listen to everyone because you'll be running around like a headless chicken. You have to
That's
listen to yourself and do your own thing, and then find out for yourself what is going to work.
that's the balance. I've just looked, by the way, Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but that brings me on to, sort of my main final question, really. I ask everyone this, but I think it's particularly applicable as we've talked about to the process of magazine making. What advice would you give to the youth looking to get into the industry, either to make magazines as the beginning and the end of what they want to do, or to use the process of magazine making and publishing as a stepping stone to learn that creative process? How do they get into it? How do they make a start? How indeed do they then go and get published independently and such? What direction is the best one to go in, basically?
We do a lot of work with universities, and students from graphic design, art direction, marketing, fashion, photography, journalism, um, and the students are all really, really excited by print. They're not so excited by digital, but they know they're probably going to be working with digital. But they're what makes their eyes light up is print. Um, and there is a sort of, it's quite clear that there's a large desire amongst people involved in the creative industries to find their voice, and find a vehicle for that voice. And print is a natural one to look to. It's deemed to be a very positive and exciting thing to be involved in. The key thing, I've already said it. The key thing is to be dealing with something that you're really passionate about. It's not enough to be passionate about magazines, although that's helpful. I mean, perhaps that's essential, but even more essential is you have to be passionate about the subject that you're talking about. Um, and it goes back to, I mean, I mentioned I worked at John Brown, and we were working about creating magazines for clients. And the most, a potential client would come to you, and they say, we want to do a magazine, and the reason we want to do a magazine is X and Y. And there were times when, certainly from a creative standpoint, from my standpoint, I would sit there and think, you don't need a magazine. That's not the right answer. I mean, I can see what you're obviously into magazines, and you're enjoying the idea of having a magazine, and you're talking to the right people if you want to get a magazine. But what you actually need to be doing is a below the line advertising camp, or whatever it was. There are different ways to achieve what you're trying to achieve. A magazine isn't always the answer, but the point I'm trying to get to is that you need, in order to have a voice, you need to have something to say, and depending on what you want to say and who you want to say to, dictates the medium you're going to use. And if a magazine is right, then fantastic, give it a go. You might find it's better to start off on social, and building an audience in some other manner, and then develop it somewhere else. Um, we see lots of examples of that. I think a brilliant example of that is the magazine Vittles, which came out about 3 or 4 months ago. But that was launched by a food journalist called Jonathan Nunn, who who found his voice during COVID, when he just started tweeting, as it was then. He started tweeting critiques of the general level of food criticism, and how he just started taking on the kind of world of food criticism by critiquing it. And from there, he started an Instagram feed where he began to add his own opinions about restaurants, and reviewing, etc. And that subsequently became a hugely successful Substack. And now he's launched a print magazine. And I think that's something, it's not necessarily everyone will make the same leaps in the same order. But the point is, he found something he was really passionate about, started opining in public about it, and then things developed into, and now he's got a business running a Substack, and he's launched into print. It's a beautiful magazine, by the way. It's a great example of print, of modern publishing, and that's how it works. There's no, but it'll be different for someone else. It'll be different for someone else again. But the point is, you have to come from the point of view of having a passion for something, and believing in your point of view, believing you've got something to say and that there are going to be people willing to listen.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. Um,
Pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation. I'm not sure we've resolved too much about the actual meaning of the word magazine, but
well, that's fine. We'll pull the definition from somewhere. But no, fascinating insight into the industry, how it's evolved, and where it sits today. So, Jeremy Leslie, thank you very much.
thanks, Jamie. All the best.